An oligopoly is defined by a market where there's only a few sellers. As a result, because there's only a few sellers, they can interact strategically one with another in determining the price and quantity. So in perfect competition, there's many sellers, and they're all identical, and so there's no room for strategic interaction. In a monopoly, there's only one seller. In monopolistic competition, there's also many sellers, even though they have differentiated goods. So an oligopoly is going to be a different type of market that we're going to examine. And this is best highlighted by looking at game theory. So game theory is a study of strategic interactions. So here we have an example of a game theory type game. So this is a 2x2 game, meaning that each player, or each company in this case, has two actions to choose from. So let's look at company one, Johnson's Tires, right? A staple to the Springville community. Johnson's Tires has two strategies. They can advertise or not advertise. That's within their choice set. On the other hand, Rocky's Tires, a stalwart in the Spanish Fort community, also can choose between not advertising and advertising. Based on the strategies they choose, there's payoffs. So if Johnson chooses don't advertise and Rocky's chooses don't advertise, that leads us to this outcome here. And in this outcome, the first number is for the player on the left, or player one. Johnson would receive $20 million in profits. Meanwhile, Rocky would receive $10 million in profits. If they both choose to advertise, then Johnson would receive $15 million in profits. Let's actually make that blue. $15 million in profits, whereas Rocky would earn $8 million in profits. And so the question is, based off of this structure of the strategies and the payouts, what would each company choose to do? Well, let's first look at Johnson. Johnson's going to assume that Rocky is going to not advertise. In that case, Johnson has the choice between the strategy of don't advertise and advertise. If they choose not to advertise, they would get $20 million in profits. But if they choose to advertise, they would get $23 million in profits. Well, 23 is greater than 20, so we're going to put a check mark here, because if Rocky's Tires decides to not advertise, it would be in Johnson Tires' best interest to advertise. Now, if Rocky chooses not to, or if Rocky chooses to advertise, what would Johnson Tire do? Well, they're going to choose between $14 million and $15 million, because that's their strategies, is to advertise or not. And so we're going to put another check mark here, because it's in Johnson Tire's best interest to advertise. And what you notice here is that independent of what Rocky Tire decides to do, based on these payoffs, Johnson's Tire is always better off to advertise. We call that a dominant strategy. Well, now let's look at Rocky. So if Johnson Tire decides to advertise, then Rocky is going to choose between don't advertise and $10 million and advertise and $16 million. Well, 16 is greater than 10, so it's in Rocky's best interest to advertise. If Johnson Tire decides to advertise, and that's their strategy, then what's the best response for Rocky? Well, if they don't advertise, they would get $7 million. If they do advertise, they would get $8 million. 8 is greater than 7, so Rocky is going to choose to advertise. And now what you see is that this box here has two check marks. That's what we call the Nash equilibrium. And in that box, neither firm has an incentive to deviate. So let's look to see what would happen, right? Is if Johnson makes $15 million and Rocky's going to advertise, if Johnson decides to deviate and to not advertise, they would actually lose $1 million, so they're not going to deviate. Right? Rocky's making $8 million, but if they decide to not advertise, then they'd actually lose money. So a Nash equilibrium is defined as there's no incentive for either firm to deviate. And we would write that Nash equilibrium in terms of strategies is advertise and advertise, meaning that given this strategy and this payout, both firms would decide to advertise. What's interesting about this game is notice that the outcome of $15 million to Johnson and $8 million to Rockies is actually less than if they both decided not to advertise. However, this outcome here is not a Nash equilibrium, because if Rocky Tire decides to not advertise, then Johnson would actually have an incentive to deviate from don't advertise and to advertise. So this is not a Nash equilibrium here because each firm has an incentive to deviate. And so these games where the outcome is that both firms are actually worse off than if they were to cooperate together are known as prisoner's dilemma. But not every game has to be a prisoner's dilemma. Here's an example of Johnson and Rocky's tires, but I've now changed the payouts, even though they have the same strategy. So to find the Nash equilibrium, or the outcome we would expect, let's consider the case where Rocky is going to not advertise. Well, given if Johnson Tire assumes that Rocky is not going to advertise, then Johnson can get $20 million if they don't advertise, and $18 million if they do. Therefore, it'll be in Johnson's Tire's best interest not to advertise. And if they assume that Rocky's Tire is going to advertise, again, Johnson's choosing between 14 and 12. And so 14 is greater. So in this case, Johnson will choose not to advertise. So Johnson now has a dominant strategy to not advertise. Well, let's see what Rocky will do. Well, if Johnson Tire is going to not advertise, Rocky's best interest is if they don't advertise, they get 10. If they do advertise, they get 16. 16 tends to be greater than 10. So we'd put a check mark there, right? And if Johnson says that they're going to advertise, then Rocky is determining between don't advertise and advertise, which is 8 compared to 7. 8 is greater, so we put a check mark there. Based on these payoffs, Rocky Tire has a dominant strategy to advertise. However, the Nash equilibrium falls right here, where in this case, the Nash equilibrium is that Johnson Tire, their player one, don't advertise, and Rocky Tire would advertise. And at that point, there is no incentive for either to deviate. So if Johnson tries to deviate, they would go down to 12 instead of 14. They won't. If Rocky tries to deviate, they'd go from 16 down to 10, and so they won't do that. And so this is our Nash equilibrium. And oligopolies, because there's few players or few suppliers, these firms can interact strategically in determining how much to produce and what to do as a business.